In discussions about Star Wars media, negativity about the Star Wars sequel trilogy has long since eclipsed negativity about the Star Wars prequel trilogy. I like talking about Star Wars, but I didn't have a video for May the 4th and only toyed with the idea of making this one a couple weeks prior. Frankly, broaching discussions about Star Wars media in general can feel like a trap sometimes on this platform, but I'm prepared to spring the trap. I've since rewatched all of the Star Wars sequels with the aim of zeroing in on how one of my favorite characters in them was written, and now I'd like to share that with all of you. I call Rey one of my favorite characters in the Star Wars sequels, and she definitely is. A huge part of that is just that I love the way Daisy Ridley plays her. I think as an actress she has immense charisma, range, and emotive ability. A huge number of Rey's scenes are carried by how purely emotionally empathetic Daisy Ridley is. I don't know if it's good enough to be considered the saving grace of the sequel trilogy, but many of the actors are just that good, so the best case scenario is their performance carries a scene, and the worst case scenario is that they feel underutilized in a role that could have been much more. Mark Hamill obviously sticks out in the former category, whereas John Boyega is probably in the latter. Both quite talented in general, both actors with good screen presence in these films, and as a bonus, there's probably an Attack of the Tyrones joke in there somewhere, but I'm unsure if enough of the people who see this video will have watched They Cloned Tyrone for that to scan. If not, hey, there's a fun movie recommendation for you. There will be a few diversions in this video where I bring up certain performances, certain instances of character writing, and certain instances of film editing and direction. All of these, I think, contribute to our understanding of Rey as well as the characters with whom she interacts, so they'll inform our analysis. I'm most interested with the pace at which Rey Skywalker's arc develops, where she's allowed to be a fleshed out character and where she isn't, where in the narrative her character arc finally culminates, and how everything up until that point comes across in the process. As such, a not insignificant portion of this video will involve summarizing events from the films, but because we'll be looking strictly at scenes that inform Rey's character, we can skip a lot of extra material. However, even given that, I imagine having the things that occur in a film recounted step by step is tedious, so the summary of each film's treatment of Rey will be as focused and condensed as possible with notes along the way. I have a fun interlude planned for later, and I think you'll at least find my conclusion provocative, but there isn't much to say about Rey herself until we're all up to speed. I do want to make an extra note that the earliest draft of this essay felt far too negative. I'm okay with negativity. I am not, however, interested in purposeless hate that does not develop our insight into these films, and frankly, I have a lot of respect for the people who worked on them. I want to get that out of the way because I am, in fact, going to be a little harsh on certain elements of these films. I think that's fair to do because I think it's earned. I do not think a lot of the wildly uncharitable and unevidenced insinuations based on cliches and truisms have any place here, so I've done my best to even trim down the amount of that which I dipped into, because as it turns out, the emotional place people are coming from when they're unfair to these movies is actually worth treating with empathy as well, and doing so to both the creators and the audiences will put you in an unenviable position. If sections of this video seem overly harsh in either direction, hopefully that's because I'm being curt and not spiteful. My intention here isn't to needlessly rag on a series of films anyone could take potshots at, more or less justifiably. I think there's actually something instructive here about what I see as the mishandling of one of the main characters introduced in this trilogy. The corollary for that analysis is that we're going to give some nods here and there to what these films seem to have been doing that ranges from the interesting but underdeveloped to the compelling but underserved. There's very little reason to be overly fixated on value judgments here beyond the initial take. Yes, I think Rey Skywalker is poorly written. I think she's well acted, intriguing in concept, and just developed enough to draw the audience into her arc across these films. That isn't meant to rescue her from larger condemnation, but I do think it more than justifies the investigation of her character beyond the strong box office performance of the latest trilogy in one of the biggest blockbuster film series in all of Hollywood. I like this character, and I want to criticize the way she was written. Let's go. We don't start off in The Force Awakens following Rey's perspective, but she's introduced scavenging and living in the discarded remains of old Empire-era military technology. We see her main expertise is as a mechanic and a survivalist. She meets BB-8 and shows kindness towards him, treating him like a person. It's important to note that the film establishes very early on that Rey's key personality traits are that she cares about people, even small and discarded people who wouldn't necessarily be humanized in the eyes of others. She's clearly a Luke Skywalker type. Luke was preoccupied with his own dreams when he met C-3PO and R2-D2, but he did have the opportunity to abandon both of them at different points, and he didn't, whereas he put clear effort into cleaning and maintaining them both in scenes before and after that point in his story. We're clearly following a similar pattern here. Rey escapes the planet with Finn, surviving on the skills the film has more or less already established she has, but as they leave the planet, she reveals that she wants to stay on Jakku. Daisy Ridley has great on-screen chemistry with basically everybody, and it hard carries the character of Rey in this film, especially in the scenes with Harrison Ford. There's some tension between Han and Rey in a few of their scenes together, where he appears more intrigued by her than her mere presence on his ship would presumably draw from an aging Han Solo. Earlier drafts of these films had Rey and another character both being the children of Han and Leia, so this is clearly either left over from that point, or that door was being kept open for the future. I personally feel the difficulty J.J. Abrams seems to have had in sealing the deal that he made in this very first film is something of a mark against his mystery box storytelling style, because presumably it's supposed to matter what's inside the box, or otherwise the audience is supposed to be convinced it matters in a way that sticks with them even after the reveal, but either way we aren't there yet. On Takodana, Maz Kanata and Han Solo have this scene where they hint at Rey's real origins, or parentage, and it reinforces the earlier beat about Rey wanting to stay on Jakku, and gives some explanation for the conversation Rey and Han have upon landing, where Han seems to want to help Rey. The conversation in the cantina solidifies the contrast between Rey and Finn that should theoretically position Finn as a foil to Rey. A narrative foil, for the uninitiated, is when a character is written as a point of contrast to another character. This helps with characterization by not only making each character stand out from each other, but also drawing out more sincere emotions through conflict and alternating points of view. At first, Finn seems like he's an excellent foil to Rey, because she presents as outwardly very headstrong and selfless, wanting to fight the First Order, and he presents as rather timid and selfish, wanting to run away. However, in context, the deeper issue here is that the script doesn't seem to keep these character traits constant. When Finn is introduced, he has an initial act of hesitation that paints him as moral, if somewhat cowardly, that culminates in a self-preserving act of bravery in his escape attempt with Poe Dameron, and subsequently his challenge as a character is to marry the better parts of those two instincts to disobey the First Order and to help others. Similarly, Rey at first is quick to rush into fights to help others like she does with BB-8, but this has the potential to get her into difficult situations, where she has to think quickly or get lucky, like she does with the Rathtars when saving Finn. The film either shows this or comes out and says it directly at different points. Her challenge theoretically would be to grow from that, to rein in her impulsivity and to use her drive to stand up for what's right in situations where it's needed most. If this is starting to sound like Finn is the main character of this story, it's because he's written like that and it should theoretically be his arc, but instead Finn misses his chance to actually walk away from the conflict, like Han in A New Hope, and Rey reverses her characterization in the middle of the film. If that sounds confusing, don't worry, we're getting there. This is among the more frustrating sections of The Force Awakens from the perspective of how these two characters are written. The question of Rey's parentage is subsequently reinforced again in the scene where she feels Anakin's and Luke's lightsaber calling out to her in the Force. When Rey touches the lightsaber, we see a rapidly cut flashback of Kylo Ren and the Knights of Ren, Luke Skywalker and the Burning Temple, and Rey being abandoned by who we would have already assumed at this point were her parents. Cutting these visuals together makes it seem like Rey is getting flashes of some great interconnected narrative that has relevance to her backstory, but if you've seen the trilogy, you know that most of these images have no bearing on each other, which in hindsight only shines a light on how Rey the aspiring rebel and Rey the lonely scavenger are two fundamentally different people in two fundamentally different stories. Upon further viewing, this may cause the audience to wonder why Rey suddenly felt such conviction about helping the Resistance that she would scold Finn about abandoning the cause, even though she was only minutes earlier in the film dead set on returning to Jakku, and only minutes later has once again gotten cold feet. The contrast between Scavenger Rey and Rebel Rey is a basic difficulty that this film is only capable of resolving by having Rey be kidnapped by Kylo Ren, which isn't entirely different from how Luke Skywalker is thrust into his story, but where Luke had any alternatives to his adventure removed, and Anakin had his adventure presented as an alternative to a terrible situation, Rey doesn't really have this component of her conflict resolved during the runtime of this film. She's simply constantly drawn away from where she wants to be, while also insisting she wants to be somewhere else. To be clear, it is by no means a pure negative to have a character with conflicting desires and ambitions. You could probably even write a movie about something like that. Rey's internal conflict, however, doesn't drive the narrative. It makes her an accessory to the narrative because, to be perfectly blunt, J.J. Abrams does not seem very intent on telling a story here. He simply advances set pieces with the brute force of action and suspense. There's drama to be had here, but only the kind you could find anywhere, from wartime propaganda films to old children's cartoons. The sense that there's something internal to Rey that she needs to overcome on any kind of philosophical, spiritual, political, social, or psychological level is almost entirely absent from this film, and as a result is shoved into the runtime of the subsequent films with mixed results. Theoretically, Rey's lack of external influence on the plot of this film could be compensated for by a strong internal conflict, but because her motivations seem muddled, and her conflict in the narrative is mostly carried by Daisy Ridley's more than sufficient pathos, the elements external to her character only reflect the indistinctive qualities internal to her character. When Maz Kanata tells Rey that whoever she's waiting for isn't coming back, but Luke Skywalker still could, it feels like she has some motivation for uniting Luke and Rey, specifically something which could be relevant to Rey, because otherwise why bother convincing Rey specifically other than the fact that the film has established she is a protagonist. This theoretical rationale presumably also gives Rey some claim to Luke's lightsaber and would explain why it called to her, at least if this trilogy was created front to back with a unifying thread, but instead Rey refuses the call. Theoretically, this seems like a pretty standard writing beat, but it's made more interesting by the fact that Rey already refused the call to adventure sufficiently when telling both Finn and Han separately that she has to go back to Jakku. The film is roughly 2 hours and 7 minutes between title screen and credits, so theoretically, this is the kind of thing we would have resolved by the first hour and 7 minutes, but apparently not, because Rey, who just scolded Finn about not walking away from the Resistance, is going to walk away from the Resistance. I'm not the first person to bring this up in the history of the human race, but the issue here is not that Rey as a character is hypocritical. Her emotions are the least problematic element of this. She's very obviously and very justifiably scared, and so the decision in isolation actually makes a lot of sense. What's weird is that her being written to have this experience and subsequently run away from her friends and lightsaber chiefly appears as a contrivance to put her in contact with Adam Driver's Kylo Ren, also known as Ben Solo, who will kidnap Rey and remove any conflict in her character that exists independent of other characters for the remainder of the film. Rey running into the forest in the first place is another instance where her characterization, which previously positioned her squarely as a brave foil to the more cowardly Finn, now casts her as a coward, while Finn gets to confront stormtroopers in a battle and be the brave hero. This almost makes me wonder whether Finn should have been written as more of a self-centered scoundrel despite John Boyega's humorous acting, and whether Rey should have been written as a more cowardly but good-natured person who runs away from conflict but always tries to support others, marrying her history as someone who likes fixing things and her status as a survivalist with her dual desires to remain on Jakku as well as help the Resistance. She'd like to help, don't you know, but there's someone else who left her there, and she's scared of what will happen if she's not there when they get back. We'll touch on this dimension of her character more in a bit. One of the biggest pieces of character growth that Rey receives in this film is facilitated via her newly minted relationship with Kylo Ren, who exists as her counter in the Force, where she rises as he does. She discovers her powers chiefly by virtue of having her mind invaded by him, and to give credit where credit is due, the character dynamic between these two is basically the crux of the whole trilogy, and there's enough fear and intrigue between the two of them to make it work. Rey and Finn watch as Kylo Ren kills Han Solo, and he follows them outside to finish the job. Rey is tossed around like a rag doll so Finn can have his moment of heroism, while Kylo Ren plays with his food, and we get another classic J.J. Abrams fake-out, the one trick in the arsenal of the mystery box storyteller, where Rey then has to save Finn as she pulls the lightsaber away from its path towards Kylo Ren so that she can have her face-off with the main villain as well. This story constantly feels like it fails to differentiate its two key protagonists, and they are chiefly two, since keeping Poe Dameron in the narrative for long enough that Oscar Isaac would get to develop any significant on-screen chemistry with Rey seems to have been too much to ask. The film is chiefly occupied with using Poe Dameron for an earlier, classic J.J. Abrams fake-out. I'm sure from a certain point of view this feels terribly clever, because Poe was going to be killed off and then got to be in the film anyway, but Abrams was only getting Oscar Isaac's character out of a situation he had gotten him into, so it feels like another case of the Star Wars sequels underserving a great actor. The film ends with Rey finally seeking out Luke Skywalker, and we're left with the shocked impression that somewhere in the drafts of this script, there must certainly have been a certified r/men writing women moment, as Rey's arc, which began with her helping to complete the quest of a man and peaked with her being kidnapped by another man, culminates in her seeking the help of another third man. This film isn't passing any Bechdel tests that I can see, I'll tell you that much. Seriously though, Rey feels like the world's most capable, self-reliant, and hyper-competent damsel in distress ever of all time. Heading into The Last Jedi coming off The Force Awakens feels like a long drink of cool water after being lost in the desert for 40 days and 40 nights on my hands and knees. I was begging the director for 2 straight hours to deliver a film that felt like it was written to be an actual story with a coherent narrative, and maybe it's just me, but now that we've reached the middle of our double-decker compliment sandwich, I think it's about time to make note of the fact that while Rey was always loosely in the role of audience surrogate, this is the film that best makes use of her empathetic relationship to the audience for narrative purposes. This begins with her first real scene where Luke throws away his lightsaber, and Rey's shock lines up more or less with the surprise of the audience, a tandem relationship that will last throughout a significant portion of the film, and whose absence will be mourned. Another great thing about having Rey and Luke together for so much of this film, beyond Mark Hamill and Daisy Ridley going together like ice cream and sprinkles, is the fact that Luke actually does work as a consistent foil to Rey, and the characters even have these mostly neat arcs that work out pretty tidily. Rey has faith in Kylo Ren, Luke has none. Rey has faith in the Jedi, Luke has none. Rey has faith in the Resistance, Luke has none. You can see where this is going. Luke is the cynical, jaded counterbalance to Rey's wide-eyed optimism and hope for the future, which of course is decent writing when giving these characters things to do on screen, but in combination with the setup for the film means Luke needs to have some kind of low point, especially if he's to have any sort of arc. And characters have arcs now. Remember dynamic character writing? We're bringing that back, and all 4 major protagonists, including Luke this time, can have some. Wouldn't it be worse if early in the film, Rian Johnson pretended to kill off Finn or Luke, only to bring them back later for a soaring John Williams musical Star Wars moment? It sure would be, and I'm glad we're done with The Force Awakens, so we don't have to deal with any more of that, because doing that 2 or 3 more times would be really exhausting. What? Why are you all looking at me like that? I like the intrigue of Rey being drawn into the mist of the island on Ahch-To, and Luke initially ignoring her, but having his curiosity piqued by the fact that she somehow knows where she is, which again is a super compelling bit of characterization that builds on the previous film and relates back to Rey's parentage. Even if she isn't related to any of our main characters, and obviously the one this film is pointing to the most is Luke, she seems like she's supposed to be Luke's daughter. Rian Johnson gives just enough ambiguity to string us along during the film. It sure would be depressing if Rey's parentage turned out to be a red herring in a kind of clever way, and then that got resolved, but the fact that Rey had been dreaming of Luke Skywalker's location despite the fact that the First Order presumably didn't have that information since they have no idea where Luke is, was all somehow never expanded upon. That has to be what's really interesting at the outset of this film. There's this sense that one way or another, Rey is actually connected to these people and this place, even if it's not in the way we're supposed to think. The Force is connecting Rey and Kylo Ren, which allows those two characters to further develop a dynamic that probably should have been more intense if he was going to try to tempt her at the end of The Force Awakens, given that a charitably counted 3 conversations are probably not enough on their own to sway someone's entire moral worldview without any other incentive given. These sequences resolve this issue by giving Rey something to be tempted by. Kylo Ren is using Luke's own human faults and Rey's own thirst for knowledge against both of them, manipulating her for the sake of developing their connection, using knowledge against her as a parallel to what Sidious did to Anakin. You can tell Rian Johnson and the writers paid some attention to the prequels and wanted this film specifically to feel like it wasn't ignoring their existence. In one of Rey's connections with Kylo Ren, the famous shirtless scene, he points out directly that Rey's greatest personality flaw is that she needs her parents and looks for replacements for them in other authority figures. This does at least play into her actual conflict in this film as opposed to being nodded to and then subsequently ignored. This is where we get her scene with the dark mirror underneath the island, the dark side torturing her with temptation and fear, and again Kylo Ren preys on this, with the real manipulation appearing to be his kindness towards her. This idea that he'll reveal the truth about her parents and instead insert himself into her life as a balm for that loneliness, which is cool character writing and finally gives him this sense of villainy by allowing his character flaws to play off of her character flaws. This, of course, leads to her confrontation with Luke, where we get the other version of events and the revelation of the impetus for his arc in this film. It presents him as simultaneously a more grounded and more forthcoming mentor to Rey than Yoda or Obi-Wan were to him, and by proxy also positions Kylo Ren even more as a parallel to Vader than had been previously established, which deftly develops 3 characters in one beat. The crux of this conflict is that in order for this to feel meaningful, Rey needs to be taken in by Kylo Ren. Kylo Ren probably needs to betray Rey, and there needs to be some kind of loss that develops all of these characters. This probably sounds familiar to fans of the original trilogy, because like with the long chase sequence, the Jedi training with a master in exile on a remote planet, and the ascendancy of the film's antagonists, it's all clear that Rian Johnson is doing his best for the first 2 acts of the film to ape The Empire Strikes Back. Following Abrams constructing The Force Awakens in the style of A New Hope, the big danger here is probably that this will feel overly familiar and therefore predictable and safe without real risk. Accordingly, Rey seeks out Kylo. Kylo appears to betray Rey to Snoke with a lingering potential for him to still do the right thing, while Snoke interrogates Rey. This feels like another good opportunity to point out that Rey's mind has been violated in 2 films, only one of which has shown any long-term consequences for how she copes with trauma. You could think of this potentially like setup with The Force Awakens and reinforcement with The Last Jedi, presumably to be paid off in The Rise of Skywalker, where somehow Rey's trauma will be relevant to her character. When Kylo betrays Snoke, we get that iconic throne room sequence which is designed to position Ben and Rey back to back in this hectic and messy melee as the guards fight to avenge their supreme leader and the throne room burns down around them in the wreckage of the fleet. This is a well-timed emotional beat in the film, as the climax of the Holdo maneuver gives Rey the chance to escape from Kylo Ren as they tear apart Luke's lightsaber, fighting over the remnants of the previous films in the wake of their battle, showing their literal efforts to burn it all down. The shot where Rey turns to ask Kylo Ren for help, and she sees him staring at the throne, reveals that he wasn't just manipulated by Snoke. Throughout the film, there's been a persistent question of what responsibility Luke bears for Ben turning to the dark side, and naturally, the viewer has been fed competing stories where Luke forced Ben's hand or scared Ben into turning against him, where Rey posits that Luke's error was in thinking Ben's choice had already been made. In reality, all 3 of these perspectives are revealed to contain some of the truth. Luke did push Ben in an unintended direction, and Ben's future wasn't set in stone, but what Rey misses until this point is that Ben still bears responsibility for his decision, and it's conspicuous that he killed Han Solo when he had an opportunity to walk away from Snoke then and there. Rey, being the audience surrogate in a lot of ways, is idealistic and hopeful, Because she wants to see the best in both Luke and Ben, she wants to believe he will be redeemed by his betrayal of Snoke, and likewise, the viewer who knows Darth Vader's story will be tempted by the same possibility. Ben, however, as we have been repeatedly shown, is not his grandfather, and quite obviously has no son to save. He's doing this for himself, and when the time comes, he turns right back to Rey and keeps manipulating her. One criticism of this film and this scene in particular that has stood the test of time is the idea that the directors and writers of not just this film but the other films in the trilogy as well wanted to create some question in the audience's mind of whether Rey might actually turn to the dark side. And while a viewer who believes the light will always prevail against the dark is unlikely to be fooled by a feint of this variety, the responsibility of the storyteller is to take what could be, in a worse film, a cheap sleight of hand, and turn it into a compelling conflict regardless of the outcome. Taken alone, The Last Jedi resolves this beat. Rey escapes Kylo Ren, and when Ren sees her through their connection one final time, she shuts the door on him, theoretically bookending their relationship. He can no longer tempt her, no longer fool her, no longer pull her strings, and thus the final film would theoretically show a Rey that, despite having lost Han Solo and Luke Skywalker, would still doggedly pursue the path of the Jedi against the dark side. The viewer has been told there will be a resolution to this conflict, and now that the seeds have been sown, let us see what has blossomed. It's time for the sequel trilogy to end. Alright everyone, we're about to cross into the third act of our extended Skywalker Saga sequel trilogy analysis of Rey's character, and it's time to set the scene for the cinematic parallels of the rise of Skywalker. I've combed through my notes and deleted everything that I didn't feel was directly relevant to analyzing Rey's character, so hopefully I've been able to stay on track and give you a charitable but strict recounting of what I feel did and did not work well about this character, trending towards seeing each success as a largely neglected positive and each negative as a sort of haphazard fault. The difficulty with this is that bad movies on this scale don't get made on accident. They aren't the result of pure lack, a fallout from the absence of skill from writers who don't know how to write or directors who don't know how to direct. As much as my frustration with a lack of individual artistic motivation to draw these films together thematically or stylistically in the way a trilogy spearheaded by a single person might be, has probably come through here. You could levy those accusations at these films, but you'd wind up making a much better argument if you could trade on what is in the films and understand why it's there, as opposed to shrugging every time you see something that you evaluate negatively and just saying, well, I guess the directors spontaneously forgot they were making a film. It's worth noting here that these movies are fine. They're fine. The worst is yet to come, but if you talk to someone about these films, you're likely to speak with someone who either isn't really interested in seeing their demerits, or someone who can't see them as anything but apocalyptic franchise enders. The issue with apocalyptic thinking is that it mostly prepares not the world, not the things you love, but you specifically to die. It's antithetical to developing new ways of thinking because it results in shutting down thought. It can be convincing, but only if you buy into the emotional cell. I can't convince you, probably, of everything good about these films, because it requires seeing the characters and situations in a certain light. I know when The Force Awakens came out, the fandom was largely non-apocalyptic about these films, and when The Last Jedi came out, critical reception for the series was still largely positive. Some of that changed with Star Wars due to Solo and the Rise of Skywalker, as well as the subsequent ascendancy of Disney Plus as a streaming service during the COVID-19 pandemic, but even then this trilogy itself did pretty well. Hindsight is, as you've heard, 2020. I'm not here to convince you these films are poorly written, which I think is mostly true in 2 out of 3 cases, but that's because lots of people will already believe that. I've seen weird justifications for this. To spare you some misconceptions, I want to link a few videos in the description. One is How Bad Movies Are Made, featuring The Rise of Skywalker by the channel Empire Wreckers. Another is The Lost Stories of the Sequel Trilogy by the channel Pyramid Peak. These are essential viewing for getting a large sense of what was previously, not just when Lucas was involved, but even after that point, going to be done in these films, and I think some of it validates my interpretation of Rey. I've long maintained that the center of these films had something to do with Kylo Ren and the characters who relate to him, and while this isn't a video about Kylo Ren, if it was, then it would be much more positive, since he's a more consistent character whose agency is an actual driving force for the plot, in the way that is rarely the case for films in the Star Wars Skywalker saga where its female characters are concerned, with the exception of some of the prequels in Padme Amidala's case and The Last Jedi in Rey's case. The wants, needs, and ambitions of women are largely secondary in a story that is chiefly about fathers and sons, which isn't an individual fault of any specific film, but does make talking about our newest Skywalker, Rey, more difficult. Rey is clearly meant to be a Jaina Solo type. If you're like me and you're familiar with the Legends Star Wars novels, which will become relevant again later in this essay, you know that the old post-Episode 6 continuity was largely built off the work of Timothy Zahn, and developed the story of the Skywalker grandchildren, of whom there were 4. My personal theory about Rey Skywalker and Ben Solo is that they're stitched together consciously from 6 different Zanverse Legends characters, from the New Jedi Order era during the Jedi Academy, Yuuzhan Vong, and Imperial Remnant conflicts. If they aren't, then it's a massive coincidence. Ben Solo has the first name of Ben Skywalker, Luke's son with Mara Jade from the old continuity, but he also has an arc reminiscent of Jacen Solo, surname and dark side path included. He has some limited parallels with Jagged Fell as the head of state of the Imperial Remnant or First Order, an expert fighter pilot, and love interest of Jacen Solo's twin sister, Jaina. Rey and Kylo Ren are developed from storylines that previously featured 2 children of Han and Leia, and even still in the films, they bear a kind of thematic twin nature, representing new incarnations of the light side and dark side of the Force. Rey, in turn, draws on the legacy of Jaina Solo as the female Skywalker grandchild, but she also has the isolated desert upbringing of Tahiri Vela and the struggle with the darker side of her parentage that Anakin Solo had, where he was afraid of falling to the dark side, specifically because of who his grandfather was. The symmetry is undeniable. I want you to keep the larger context of these films, the Legends character parallels, and one last point in mind as we move into discussing the rise of Skywalker. Colin Trevorrow, who you may know for his work on the Jurassic World films, was originally working on Star Wars Episode 9, Duel of the Fates, before leaving the project in advance of it being reworked into Star Wars Episode 9, The Rise of Skywalker. Entire videos have been produced about this in and of itself, and maybe one day I'll specifically make one about the Rise of Skywalker discussing it in this light. But for now, it's enough to note that there's another film that Trevorrow directed just prior, called The Book of Henry. The film was negatively received for eminently sympathetic reasons that cannot all be attributed to Trevorrow, and his willingness to stand by the project speaks well to his integrity. Actually, I would say the same about J.J. Abrams and his work on this trilogy. Abrams stepped back in after Trevorrow was let go from the project, and while some fans treat this as the moment when the film got bad in production, I don't think that view holds up perfectly, as shown in some of the struggles highlighted in the 2 previously mentioned videos. I bring up Trevorrow and the Book of Henry because the third video recommendation I have for you all is a Dan Olson video about that film. I sometimes name drop channels like Folding Ideas because they've been legitimately helpful in giving me some frame of reference for understanding films, since my earlier acknowledged point of reference for writing is not experience with that medium. As such, I was a little surprised when I recalled a video of his while rewatching The Rise of Skywalker. It deals with the Book of Henry at the level of its writing and direction, but the thing that really comes through here in parallel to another film Trevorrow was ironically previously working on comes at the end of both films. Normally, I quote people's videos in my own essays, but I think decontextualizing this point would be a disservice to it since you really have to have seen the thing itself. Ideally, you'd watch The Book of Henry and The Rise of Skywalker, as well as the other sequel films to get the full measure of everything I'm saying here, but I'd be content if you just watched Dan Olson's video for now. What I found valuable about this breakdown of the scene at the end of the film when I first saw this video is how it privileges what the visual language of the film is presenting the audience with first, over the way the narrative might be abstractly understood. Henry is dead. His brother is doing this magic trick. The film is referencing an earlier scene, but the narrative makes that reference something only the brother, Peter, and the audience will grasp in its significance. Contextually, the show itself involves Peter saying he's about to bring Henry back among the audience, and then he causes the fake snow to fall, which creates a visual metaphor of Henry's ashes being scattered among the audience. The scene is emotionally confused, not just because the audience has some limited reason to believe Henry might literally be there, as opposed to just metaphorically, but also because the audience of the film this time, not the magic trick, understands this beat in the film is supposed to be triumphant, but they're told visually that a dead child's ashes are being scattered to applause, which in itself doesn't make a ton of sense, because the assembled persons were not present for the scene to which the fake snow is a visual callback. The larger narrative context of the film is actually weirder, but because Henry is an allegory for Jesus Christ, the triumph here vaguely scans as, yay, he's really dead, here's the proof, and not, he has returned to redeem us, or everything happens as he foretold, because he hasn't and it didn't. Why does this matter? Well, because bad films don't get made on accident, and characters in bad films aren't determined exclusively by thought-terminating cliches that might validate our larger reading of them, their films, Hollywood, or society. A lot of commentary about these Star Wars films completely neglects what they're actually doing, and never ascends above the level of sniping you could find in any social media post. However, it's a benefit to critique to take the art seriously. The common conflation of criticism with negativity loses the thread of the function of critique. If you're criticizing to criticize, understanding is what you want, and that should theoretically lead you anywhere. I often find that the limitations of a work of art are precisely a part of what makes it interesting, faults included, and that its successes, far from being a counterbalance to those faults, usually have a direct relationship with them. The Rise of Skywalker is like that. And so, while you hold the Jesus and Peter metaphor and the visual language of the end of the Book of Henry in your mind during this discussion of the Rise of Skywalker, please consider how what's actually happening here and why it's so fascinating has a strong relationship with what went wrong with this movie. Gardening needs fertilizer, and fertilizer is refuse. Discarded and useless remains, often literal shit, are recycled by the environment and feed new life, a cycle that is itself what the Force in Star Wars represents in many ways. The Jedi philosophy of protecting that cycle is what makes their place in these narratives so provocative, because that developmental notion of life is at odds with this systems-oriented, managerial liberalism that was the ascendant ideology when the prequels were being made, and which is one object of the critique present in the political text of those films. Accordingly, the tragedy of the progression is the danger to real human life that is inherent in the death of that system. This is, among other things, why near the opening of The Phantom Menace, Obi-Wan describes two societies, the Naboo and the Gungans, as forming a symbiont circle, and why near the end of The Revenge of the Sith, Padme describes the founding of the Empire as the death of liberty. This isn't just poetic language, it actually shows that the developing history of these societies has its parallel in the nature of the Force. A good Star Wars film, therefore, has something to say about life and society. The Last Jedi was a more competently made film than its older and younger siblings, but in the absence of any real development of the political, visual language of the First Order, or any involvement of Rey's psychology in her approach to the Force, it was left developing those pieces in a technically strong but regrettably closed system. The idea that a film would come after The Last Jedi is a strange one upon rewatching the trilogy, because while you know that the First Order and Kylo Ren still need to be defeated, the general spirit of the film seems to assert an internally defensible thesis that nevertheless does not leave much else unsolved beyond those two threads. Consider Anakin's story as a point of contrast. For as much as fandom discourse would have you believe otherwise, I recall just as much hate and vitriol being directed at the prequel trilogy as the sequel trilogy. But at least in Anakin's case, his trauma from his upbringing and the loss of his relationship with his mother makes him emotionally erratic, possessive, and afraid of loss. This is reinforced by her death, such that when he later fears he will lose his wife and unborn child, it drives him to lash out. I recall many commentaries on Anakin at the time saying he seemed cringy or that his decisions don't make sense. Predictably, some fans chose a Wikipedia-style response to this provocation in later years, by positing that Anakin's decision makes sense because of what he was trying to do. Frankly, I'm a little concerned for the empathy and emotional development of at least a few of the people who make these sorts of statements. All kidding aside, Anakin's decision does not make sense, and that's the point. From a certain point of view, his irrational behavior is motivated by a fear that balloons out of proportion, a kind of malignant, bottomless need for emotional connection, characteristic of some people who experience these exact sorts of traumas. By comparison, Rey's decision not to join Kylo Ren makes sense. Too much sense. It's a rational call, but Rey is, in this one respect, more like Anakin than Luke or Ben. She has the traumatic upbringing of a slave. She's abandoned by her parents. She quickly loses her first father figure and feels inadequate by the standards of her second father figure, all of which makes her ripe for temptation by the dark side and manipulation by the Sith. The beginning of The Rise of Skywalker makes it clear that the right emotional beat for the end of The Last Jedi was to have Rey continue to be manipulated by Kylo Ren, such that her struggle in the third film with the dark side is credible. This would also, critically, give the other characters more to do with each other, and maybe even give Finn the opportunity to learn to be a Jedi in the intervening time between those two films, since he's with Leia and they have the Jedi texts on the Millennium Falcon. If we're being realistic, however, the establishing elements of this film are about as good as they could be from a narrative perspective if you assume the direction they seem to want to go with the whole Dark Rey and Palpatine revival. At least we see Rey working at her Jedi training, and the Jedi texts come back into play, which is nice. Rey connects with Kylo again during her training, and has a flashback of being left behind by her parents again, as well as a little quick shot of Darkside Rey. When Rey and the gang actually set out on their adventure after we get a few scenes deep, their first stop is on Pisana, where they get involved in this big festival where Luke's coordinates led them. This is another nice touch since it doubles down on this idea that the Jedi texts are written on paper. Technically, sheets of material called flimsy would be the lore appropriate term, and reinforces that in order to keep them for years at a time, they would be re-recorded and recopied by hand. Seeing that be plot relevant is a pleasant surprise, and it's used to give the audience the impression that Rey did in fact actually read these books. In the festival, Rey is given a necklace as she watches the alien children in the celebration, and this initiates a conversation where the alien makes a faux pas and asks Rey for her surname. Here again, we have the setup for the story beat with Rey's parentage, and while it is important to set up and reinforce this again as we are now dealing with a third and different film, what's important is developing this thread in a meaningful way. Rey has a flashback earlier in the film when she's still training on the forest planet of Agen Kloss, and it not only shows the first premonition of Darkside Rey, it also shows the clip of her being left behind by her parents again. Before we can get any more of this, Rey and Kylo connect again. This is the point in the film where things start getting weird, although it only occurred to me after several rewatches why exactly I felt so strange about this. It starts to come through in the little things, like how Rey's spooky flashes of the dark side version of herself don't really seem to involve her doing anything evil except dressing like a Sith and using a red lightsaber, or how Kylo Ren describes his attempt to recruit her in the previous film as him offering her his hand, which out of context sounds a little marriage-ish. Both characters are clearly pulling away from the idea that they should be on the dark side, so this trilogy has veered into a story of star-crossed lovers, literally. But it's odd because this really rolls back to where the trilogy was during The Force Awakens. These once again feel like two characters who are curious about each other, not two that have severely betrayed each other and who have established enmity beyond their philosophical and political loyalties. Kylo grabs the beads off of Rey, which means he can find her by identifying them, and so the gang have to split. Lando Calrissian arrives to help them out of this sticky situation, and once he knows what they're up to, he tells them that he knows about the Sith technology they're looking for because he was helping Luke look for it. This is where we learn about this Ochi of Bestoon character, whose ship was tracked to that planet. The gang make their escape from the First Order, and upon seeing the ship, Rey recognizes it, but the gang crashes and they sink in the quicksand. There's this throwaway line Finn has where he claims to never have told Rey something, but it doesn't ever become relevant and is only another J.J. Abrams bait and switch, which at this point just makes it seem like these films were not planned out at the level they should have been. The dialogue is quippy and fun, and it was a good time in the theater for a lot of people, but even back then I had the sneaking suspicion that by this third film, the trilogy not only wasn't treating its predecessors as if they mattered all that much in terms of their contents, beyond a couple character deaths that become relevant to the plot of this film, it also wasn't treating its own script as if it was particularly important beyond the internal contents of one scene and how scenes led into each other. Everything operates on a moment-to-moment logic, which isn't great for a series trying to be a space opera. I'm doing my best to restrain myself from criticizing literally everything that happens in this film. There's a serpent in the underground tunnels and Rey heals it with the Force, which is cool, but that engenders the question of how it was injured in the first place, which the film doesn't seem very interested in. Larger causal connections are the big picture, and J.J. Abrams seems focused on concocting movie magic moments, which at least operate well in his ability to set up the Force healing and the subsequent sequence where Rey uses her lightsaber to slice the TIE fighter. Again, the larger causal question of why Kylo Ren was flying so close to the ground, if he wasn't going to get out to attack her or shoot her, or stop next to her, are unimportant and not developed here, so we can assume he was trying to hit his ex with his car. Cool moment, still nonsense. Rey then attempts to force pull the transport she thinks Chewie is on back down to the ground, which engages her in a tug-of-war with Kylo Ren. My thought rewatching this scene was that she has to assume, if she's thinking at all, that there's a strong chance using the Force like this will just cause the transport to crash, which makes it seem like a poor rescue tactic, but again, this is just to set up the shot where she accidentally uses Force lightning and kills everyone on board. Cool moment, still nonsense. Since I'm a Legends fan, it didn't surprise me that theoretically Chewbacca could be killed off. After all, that's exactly what happened in the original post-Return of the Jedi timeline. However, the way this presents in the moment is as an extension of the idea that Rey can't let go. She couldn't let Chewie go, and now the consequences are worse overall. It's a microcosm of Anakin's arc with Padme, which threatens to make Rey into a marginally compromised character like the previous 8 films have already established Anakin and Luke both tended to be, but this heads in the worst direction imaginable. Rey discloses that she had a vision of her and Kylo Ren ruling the Sith Empire together, which is a mild issue to say the least, since it makes it seem like she's more scared of her own potential moral grayitude than whatever fear of loss would push her towards it. This might not sound like a real problem, but it becomes one when you realize that it means her fear of being evil eclipses everything that could make her evil, so this film has implicitly told us immediately after the act itself that there's nothing to worry about because Rey is a good person who does not want to be bad. The emotionality in that scene makes it seem like there's a real threat here. Rey is fighting the inevitable, that something is drawing her to the dark side, despite her desires and not because of them, which is interesting, but definitely not what the previous film that actually gave Rey an arc about her desires established in detail. Theoretically, if it has been built up before this, there's a possibility that Rey, in seeking to be a good Jedi, could actually become an evil Sith. That would play into a kind of Greek tragic dance with fate, with Rey creating her destiny by the very act of trying to avoid it, and poetically destroying herself in the process. This is, after all, what Anakin does in the prequels by killing his wife because of what he became as the result of what he had done with the original intent of saving her. The issue here is not merely that this is a reset of Rey's motivation, it's also totally undercut by the scene immediately afterward, which discloses that Chewie is not dead, so the accident didn't even really impugn Rey's character any more than killing stormtroopers normally would, assuming only First Order soldiers were on that ship. Other than bonding with Zori Bliss and mourning C-3PO, Rey's big bit of development here is a reiteration on something we see in The Force Awakens, which is her kindness to droids and other beings seen as less than sentient. There's the bones of something here, something about the Force and the Jedi, but it never develops beyond this. It's just strong characterization. I'm reminded of an old plot beat from a post-Episode 6 Legends novel where Ben Skywalker discovers a way to feel droids in the Force. Something is happening here, or rather it could have. Rey feels Chewie is alive on the Star Destroyer that arrives to search for the gang on Kijimi, and this initiates the attempt to rescue Chewie. During the course of the attempt, Rey arrives in Kylo Ren's room while he's absent, and we have our third Rey and Kylo connection, which draws together the flashbacks of her parents and the thread about Ochi's ship with Kylo's manipulation. The good bits of news about this scene are that I like some of the effects of the objects in one set falling into the other, and I like that we're getting more lightsaber combat. The bad news is everything else. Rey attacks him out of anger and fear, but now she says, "I don't want this," as if the whole 2 previous films in the trilogy were not her very much wanting this and not really ever moving beyond it, except in that she believed Kylo Ren when he told her that her parents were no one. The twist here is, obviously, if you're familiar with this film and its reception, that Rey is Palpatine's granddaughter, that her parents abandoned her on Jakku because they thought she would be safe there, which is a lot to ask the audience to believe given that we've established she was sold into slavery and had to work for her food under a crime lord, and Ochi killed her parents. I kind of empathize with Rey's weird protests that Kylo Ren stop this, because watching it, I want it to stop too. It's worth explaining, I think, why exactly this is such an issue. We have, at this point, completely reversed course on Rey's entire character. Throughout The Last Jedi, she was built up from her more static persona in The Force Awakens to have a tension in her desire to see her parents, to know them or even meet them again. That this desire is something she has was written into the genesis of her character and maintained right up until this film. That her character then became dynamic and needed some sort of resolution to the conflict with her desire to know her parents, even if it came at the very final scene of the final film in the trilogy, was still a benefit to the writing in these films. The protestations that Kylo stopped telling her what he knows seem strange, because she does have every reason not to trust him, but she also hasn't totally shut herself off from him, and still very much wants to know about her parents. In theory, I can see the bare bones of this scene in concept. I can understand that Rey wouldn't want to talk to Kylo Ren again, and if this was their first exchange, it would make a lot of sense, but it isn't, so every aspect of this feels like the trilogy is course-correcting very late in the game for no particular reason. I get the suspicion that the writers here, or maybe editors or director, were in some sort of bind, because Rey begging not to be told her parents' identities and their significance to her current situation is both new and contradictory, which could be the result of some kind of shift in her character, but it happens so fast that it feels like it's a scene out of another script. The film is still teasing the reveal of Rey's true identity an hour in, which almost necessarily is going to make it feel like it has no bearing to the plot, given that it's only going to be explored in its extra significance in the final hour of a 6-hour trilogy. The idea that Rey was no one was frankly preferable, not because it's odd to imagine Palpatine having a clone that had a kid who had a kid, but specifically because Rey's parentage was an issue of her potential to be corrupted by the dark side. It was an implicitly personal and even contextually spiritual struggle for her as an aspiring Jedi. This makes it into something different. Now that Rey and Kylo Ren are facing off in the Star Destroyer's hangar, she suddenly does want to hear him tell her about her parents again. So again, we've lost the connectivity of this film as a larger narrative. Kylo Ren's answer as to why Palpatine wanted to kill Rey is that he saw what she would become. The reveal is that Rey is a Palpatine. One of her parents was the child of a clone of Palpatine. The film has established Palpatine was using clones, so that element isn't surprising, but it is a bit late in the game to introduce a main antagonist and even later to explain their motives. The Rise of Skywalker operates on a kind of post hoc ergo propter hoc film logic, where, similar to how the Kuleshov effect creates an impression that, for example, a shot of a man taking his medicine and then another shot of him smiling and laughing with his friends implies that his medicine enabled him to have fun with his friends purely by virtue of the juxtaposition of scenes and with no other explanation, so too do events following from other events indicate implicitly a kind of procedure of action that retrospectively explains character motives. Palpatine is shown to have returned, and Kylo Ren serves him. We see it reinforced that Rey is still struggling with her parentage. The film is implying Palpatine came back at this point in time because using Rey was convenient to him. He'll come out and say it later, but the further implication is that he sent a killer to kill Rey's parents to find out where Rey was because he knew what she would become, but that this was all an elaborate ploy to create the exact situation in which the characters currently find themselves. In The Return of the Jedi, the Emperor sets a similar trap, where Luke and the Rebel Alliance find themselves believing he's vulnerable and being, to use his words, sorely mistaken. They played right into Palpatine's hands, but the practical order of events here implies Palpatine was playing chess with himself and losing, which feels wrong, but it does put Rey through her paces to have her own similar Return of the Jedi moment. This is an unfortunate outgrowth of what appears, at least in these films, to be J.J. Abrams' style of using what he infamously calls mystery box storytelling. I think a better analogy here would be a shell game. Abrams sets the audience in The Force Awakens up to think Finn needs Poe to escape the Star Destroyer because Poe is a pilot. An action sequence then follows, which endangers the lives of these characters. We have our object of intrigue, Poe Dameron, and whether he lives or dies, and Abrams shuffles the shells while we try to track the story. His most frequent, cheapest, and easiest trick is to use sleight of hand to show us that none of the shells contain the object. You were so busy asking whether Poe lives or dies that you didn't notice Poe was up Abrams' sleeve, and now he's rescuing our heroes from Takodana. This irregularity, when it overstays its welcome and becomes a regularity, leads to the viewer potentially feeling swindled, like the director is making fun of them for being invested in the outcome of a given conflict in a story. Throughout this trilogy, meaning in 2 of his films, Abrams does this at least 5 to 7 times, depending on how we count it. We are led to believe Poe dies on Jakku, but he heroically arrives on Takodana. We are meant to believe R2-D2 will never reactivate, but he does after the heroes win in the battle. We are meant to believe Rey has killed Chewbacca when he is immediately revealed to be fine and they attempt to rescue. We are shown C-3PO is losing his memories and will no longer be the person he was until later in the film he gets his memories back. We are led to believe that Kijimi, the planet where lovable new characters like Zori Bliss and Babu Frick are shown to live, was blown up and them with it, but they arrive in the final battle. We are led to believe Ben falls to his death, but he climbs back out for a triumphant rescue of Rey to redeem his character. There is a way to use film direction to make things like this work, and ironically we see it in The Last Jedi. We see the lightsaber turn as Snoke speaks, giving away what Kylo Ren is doing before the twist where he kills Snoke. We see Phasma knock Finn down, but the camera angle showing her conspicuously doesn't show where he fell, allowing him to stand back up on a platform rising out of that pit and strike back at her. The camera follows Kylo's action as he slashes through Luke, but the reveal looking back at Luke is that he's still standing, whereupon Kylo Ren touches Luke with his lightsaber and reveals he's just an apparition, as foreshadowed by the fact that unlike Kylo Ren, Luke moved seemingly without real weight on his environment, and even left no streaks of red in the salt gravel at their feet, which is what the shot of Kylo Ren sliding forward shows. The last of these is my favorite because of how well constructed it is, and this all goes to show that not every twist reveal has to feel cheap. Abrams' films, unfortunately, make something like a third of the vocally named cast temporarily immortal just because he keeps scooping them into his pockets to deploy later when he needs an ace. It's true that there isn't a problem necessarily with individual beats that operate in this way. It can work. There's a real structural problem, however, with the unity of these 2 previously mentioned issues. Abrams is intent both on building the film around his movie magic moments that present the audience with an iconic picture in motion, but he's also extremely invested in using retroactive developments to grant motivation to characters, which is probably why Rey's arc in The Force Awakens chiefly involves her being kidnapped, and why her arc in The Rise of Skywalker involves her being railroaded by this sense of the fate of her bloodline. That there are a number of contradictions in her motivations that arise in the process is the result of the lack of connective tissue between the scenes. That the reveals feel cheapened by their lack of prior cause combines with the fact that using this style of storytelling to drive a character's arc means they're always being revealed to have always been going where they are, despite any proximate cause arising from their own psychology beforehand. It's directional amnesia. Abrams might as well tell the audience, all will be revealed, just don't expect the reveal to tell you anything. Anything can happen, and it will, and there's no way of knowing what. There is no cause and effect, only before and after, and we have to be content with that. We'll skip ahead of Kylo Ren's revelation that he and Rey are a dyad in the Force, and into the upcoming conflict on Kef Bir, just by noting that in passing, Palpatine's theme from the original trilogy plays softly, and she stares into the distance while telling Finn about how she's going to destroy Palpatine. This is yet another wrinkle in a series of new wrinkles in the story of this trilogy that is only really being brought up now, and hangs very heavily on Rian Johnson's thematic work in The Last Jedi, developing the idea that it's more useful to the Resistance to try and help each other and other people than get hung up on trying to destroy everything put in front of them. But even then, this is a decades-old callback to a previous trilogy in the series, and mostly just reestablishes for the audience that this film is concerned with the moral weight of how Palpatine is defeated as much as anything else, which now feels like one too many layers of narrative to fold into too small a period of time for them to really be developed. Rey was initially mired in the dark side, tempting her with security from her fear of loneliness, but now we've added this bloodline component and her potential to defeat Palpatine in the wrong way. It feels like this film is juggling a suspicious number of threads that are mostly its own creation and seem entirely unnecessary. Alternatively, if this really was the vision for the film, it feels like The Force Awakens was the time to set up some of this stuff more concretely. But if you can randomly reveal your heroes are still alive constantly, I suppose there's no reason why you can't keep tacking new moral dilemmas and new antagonists onto the narrative as well, foolish and unnecessary though it may be. When Rey does end up retrieving the Sith Wayfinder from the ruins of the fallen Death Star, which in general as an idea I quite like, using the wreckage of the second Death Star as a set piece is quite cool. She's confronted by her dark side self and subsequently also by Kylo Ren. I love evil Daisy Ridley, she can hiss at me any day. Leia sacrifices herself to intervene in Rey's duel with Kylo Ren. Rey is able to strike the killing blow, but uses her earlier established Force healing power to save his life as she leaves him behind, after telling him that she had in fact wanted to join him, but specifically if he was Ben Solo and not Kylo Ren. I'm getting a weird chill up my spine, like earlier with the other comment about Rey taking Ben's hand, only stronger this time. Weird. In any case, Ben sees a memory of his dead father, does the right thing this time, and throws away his lightsaber. Kylo Ren no longer. Rey goes to Ahch-To and burns Kylo Ren's TIE fighter, going into exile just as Luke had. She hesitates and then throws Luke's old lightsaber into the flames, when Luke Force Ghost catches the lightsaber. And yeah, this definitely goes hard. I'm not too petty to not hand it to J.J. Abrams when he nails something. This character moment does definitely work, and at precious little cost to any of the characters, even developing on what Rian Johnson did in the previous film in a fun way, which is nice. Luke reveals to Rey that both he and Leia had figured out Rey was a Palpatine. This works because it's an affirmation of the Rey that Luke and Leia knew, as opposed to the one she's supposedly destined to be. Luke says her actual destiny is to stop Palpatine because of what will happen if she doesn't, which is a kind of vaguely sweet, outcome-oriented notion of fate that I find oddly appealing. This culminates in Luke giving Rey Leia's old lightsaber from when Luke trained Leia, which does kind of seem like the horse coming after the cart, given that the film had already established Leia was Rey's master. This might have been nice to open with in some respect, but at least it's serviceable. Rey thinks she can't get to Exegol, but in a genuinely kind of beautiful moment, Luke tells her she has everything she needs. She plucks the other Sith Wayfinder from Kylo Ren's ship and notes that 2 were made. This parallels the lightsabers, of course, but it also parallels how The Rise of Skywalker is a film that trades on balance. Jedi and Sith, certainly, but also the 2 paths of Rey and Ben, the 2 paths to Exegol, the TIE fighter in flames, and the X-Wing beneath the waves, the way several cast members have mirrors in characters met along the way, like Janna and Zori Bliss, the 2 lightsabers from the twins, Luke and Leia, and finally, Rey and Ben as a dyad in the Force. There's a poetics of dualities in The Rise of Skywalker. This is one of the things that does make me feel like J.J. Abrams was attempting to do something with this film, and maybe it didn't come through all the way or most of the way, but it does glimmer here and there. There's something to this idea anyway, this parallel of Luke and Leia with Rey and Ben, and that deserves a mention, but not quite yet. Rey leads the Resistance into the unknown regions to Exegol. In the battle that ensues, Palpatine explains to Rey that if she kills him due to her hatred, his spirit passes into her. This obviously presents Rey with an unenviable situation where she has to look at the person who had her parents brutally killed, who was responsible for her being enslaved, who incited incidents that caused her years of torment, and whose existence has caused all this grief besides, and decide she doesn't hate him and finds some way to stop him regardless. The final nail in the coffin is the Emperor's old playbook with Luke. He shows Rey the battle raging above them and warns her that her friends don't have long. He's pressuring her, presumably to get her to act, but even if she doesn't, assuming nothing changes, he still wins, so he's secure in his victory. Palpatine does explicitly call the Resistance Rey's new family, which cements the earlier idea that she found parental figures in Luke and Leia. Just in time, the final piece falls into place with Ben Solo's arrival. The Knights of Ren absolutely wail on him as Palpatine slowly talks Rey into cutting him down. Rey uses her connection to Ben to fake Palpatine out and pass Ben the lightsaber, at which point he absolutely wastes the Knights of Ren no contest as she proceeds to do the same for Palpatine's guards. Reunited, the two Skywalkers face down Palpatine. Palpatine's last trick is to draw on their Force connection to each other to rejuvenate himself and return to his full power. Palpatine tosses Ben down the pit, and just as the battle turns in favor of the Resistance, he unleashes his Sith powers. Rey tries one final time to connect with the Force to draw upon the power and wisdom of the Jedi of the past, and with Luke and Leia's crossed lightsabers, she reflects Palpatine's lightning back at him, destroying him, the Sith throne, the Sith themselves, and enabling the Resistance to do the same to the Final Order. Rey's final effort apparently having been too much for her, she falls down and is healed by Ben, who climbs back up, haha, a literal rising Skywalker, I get it, to use the last of his strength to save her. They hug, they kiss, and then he dies. The film ends, of course, with a big triumphant moment where everyone is reunited. Finally, on Tatooine, in a final scene that everyone seems to hate, Rey goes back to where it all started, to where Leia dispatched two droids that wound up on Luke's moisture farm. She buries the lightsabers of her two masters in the sand, and, when asked her name after a look to the approving Force ghosts of Luke and Leia, says she's Rey Skywalker. She takes her new lightsaber, BB-8 in tow, and heads off into the sunset towards another adventure. Many people have picked apart this ending, and I expected to do the same, but as I was rewatching this film and hanging on every word, every lingering second of every shot, the thing that stuck in my mind is that this ending implies two equally textually evidenced things. This scene on Tatooine is trading very heavily on the ending of Revenge of the Sith on Tatooine, but the shot of Rey looking at Luke and Leia, as well as the overall tone, is a dead ringer for Return of the Jedi. This means she's in Luke's position and Luke and Leia are both in Obi-Wan and Yoda's positions, but also implicitly in Anakin's position. After all, these films have very much established a theme of found family, where Rey was seeking alternative parents, at first in Han, but eventually Luke, and implicitly also Leia. Visually, they are her adoptive parents. Rey also, however, very much has scenes with personal tension between her and Ben Solo, with certain language about taking his hand having a vague echo of something like a vow of betrothal. For a more direct example, you also have the two of them holding each other and kissing. Ben is oddly absent from this final scene, which might mean the jury is still out on whether he's actually redeemed even as a character in this story, where that question was a serious element of not one, not two, but all three sequel films. Still, as far as Rey is concerned, Ben is her partner, or the closest thing to a single continuous romance across the trilogy. Isolating that context, it feels less like Rey was adopted into the Skywalkers, and more like she married in. Welcome back, Mara Jade. I've heard it said that not every film which does something interesting is necessarily good. This is most assuredly true, and is also why whether a film is doing something interesting is a fundamentally more important question than whether a film is good. Value judgments themselves are the fuel but not the body of critique. They animate it, but they cannot contain it. Returning to the visual parallel with the Book of Henry, The Rise of Skywalker might be interpreted as doing something interesting with its Christian symbolism, and both because it exists in some context which informs that symbolism, and because of the way it's ambiguously constructed, I think it does so better. I also think it's the better of the two films, but that's not really saying much about either of them. In The Force Awakens, we see Kylo Ren carries a lightsaber, whose crossguard makes it into a Petrine cross if you look at it and squint. In The Last Jedi, Kylo Ren connects with Rey 3 times when trying to draw her away from Luke Skywalker's teachings before Luke becomes one with the Force. The Rise of Skywalker martyrs both Rey and Kylo Ren, but both have a triumphant revival in the film that allows Kylo Ren, now Ben Solo, to save Rey. Whether this metaphor is conscious or not is less the point than whether it is available. Spiritual metaphors in Star Wars have always been both omnipresent and inconclusive. The Force, the Jedi, the Sith, and everything about this galaxy are not a pure allegory of a particular religion, but stitched together from the pieces and parts of many. The point is that something significant is happening here. It deals with Emperor Palpatine, the contrast of the Jedi with the Sith, the spiritual war between them, and the deeper contents of the Force. Taking The Rise of Skywalker seriously is the right move, just as taking Rey seriously is the right move. What's being said here matters, and any criticism that suggests otherwise isn't actually critical. However, when we take these films seriously, troubles arise, and there we can locate some, in this case serious, issues with how these characters are written. The idea that Rey is asked who she is, looks to Luke and Leia for some reinforcement, and says Rey Skywalker after we have followed her on an adventure to discover her real parents, been told explicitly that she is looking for them in the main cast of the original trilogy, and seen her arrive at Luke's childhood family home, Leia's, of course, having been destroyed, cements that this scene will scan as an adoption. Luke and Leia are adopting Rey into their family, and visually they are presenting as her parents. The viewer knows Mark Hamill and Carrie Fisher are not related, but Luke Skywalker is Leia Organa's brother just as she is his sister. If Han Solo and Ben Solo were here, or even if Ben Solo was present, at least then it would look more like Rey is marrying into the family and have some plausible deniability. This in itself would be a bit odd since Ben and Rey have enough screen time together for some romantic tension, but not for the viewer to think these two people really are ready for a long-term commitment. But as such, the way this scene was shot and its place in the narrative make it appear, at least in the visual language of the film, that Luke and Leia have a daughter and her name is Rey Skywalker, and she's in love with Ben Solo, who is also Leia's son, and her half-brother, cousin? Weird. These films have more interesting things to say about Star Wars and the original trilogy than what we've previously discussed, of course. George Lucas once said in an interview that the original trilogy was about the Skywalker family, but was told from the perspective of the droids, while the prequel trilogy was about Padme Amidala and told from the perspective of the Jedi, which I think tracks. I spent some time while rewatching these films looking for who this narrative is really about, and from whose perspective it might be told, and I think I get it now. In addition to the characters from the previous films, we have new characters like Rey, Poe, Finn, and BB-8, as well as their foils, Ben, Zori, Janna, and Dio. In this respect, The Rise of Skywalker feels like a less well put together but more complete story than The Force Awakens. It has more to say. The thing these characters, with the real exception of Kylo Ren, have in common is that they're somehow on the margins of society. They're either droids, and therefore implicitly lesser life forms like BB-8 and Dio, or they're criminals like Poe and Zori, or they're deserters of a slave army like Finn and Janna, or in Rey's case, a forgotten scavenger slave. These are all people who are anathema to the First Order, which is so intent on destroying and subjugating life for the sake of a society, implicitly a human society, made in the image of Palpatine and Darth Vader. The things these powerful empires discard and disregard, surging from beneath its wreckage and refuse, are what will tear it down. The Empire is doomed. It is dragged down by the weight of all its offenses against the sanctity of life itself, because the Force is a manifestation of the underlying relationship between all living things, and against it, nothing will prosper. If these are the perspective characters of this trilogy, then who is the story really about? Well, the lesson of this video must certainly be that it is not about Rey. She is at times allowed to be interesting, but all real conflict within her character arc is driven either by her direct relationship with Kylo Ren, or with other figures like Palpatine and Luke, with whom she and Kylo Ren have a shared relationship, and through whom she is able to advance her relationship with him. It might not have been intentional, and it might not have been the plan from the beginning, but these films have wound up being far less about Rey Skywalker than they were about Ben Solo. Rey is a Skywalker, but she's a Skywalker in the way that Shmi is a Skywalker. She's relevant to the story and even of pivotal importance in some respects, but it doesn't feel like her story. This makes sense for Shmi, but for Rey it feels disappointing. Rey is advertised as our new Luke figure, and Daisy Ridley plays her with every bit of the charisma needed, but from a writing perspective, her story feels like a function of Ben's story. What animates a good story, clearly, is not merely what is pleasing to the audience. All three of these films are full of fan service moments, but when it comes to the story, this does their trilogy little credit. There's enough to chew on here that these films are probably bound for the multi-decade Star Wars movie arc of being appreciated in the long term despite themselves. We got the bad ending not because of these films, but despite The Last Jedi doing quite well and before The Rise of Skywalker even released. Disney apparently took one look at the performance of Solo and blinked in the face of one fumble, canceling a bunch of projects. Yoda says the greatest teacher is failure, but because of how the market works, corporations would prefer not to learn, and so if the audience wanted films that really felt like they were about Rey and not merely told from her perspective, a Rey Skywalker trilogy, there's a chance that could never happen, and maybe that's really the worst of it. We need to let Star Wars be art, let it be messy, let it be strange, let it be human. In a weird way, I'm looking forward to thinking about these films for the first time since The Rise of Skywalker released. Here's to a new hope for the future.